Hello and welcome to the 9th lecture podcast in the Sheridan College General Education course, Canada in the Making, Understanding Canadian History. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the period between the World Wars, so-called Interwar period from 1919 to 1939. It was a time of profound change within the country. We'll see the rise of new political parties, we'll see changes in the economy, we'll see social changes as women achieve the vote and seek recognition at the political level. We will also see the hardship and terrible conditions that Canada experienced during the Great Depression of the 1930s. All of that to come on today's lecture podcast. The learning outcomes for this lecture podcast are: number 1, describe the changing Canadian economy in the 1920s. Number 2, outline the causes and effects of the Great Depression. And number 3, articulate the changing political landscape in Canada during the interwar period. And number 4, recognize the post-war social changes in Canada. With the signing of the armistice on Monday, November 11, 1918, the Great War finally came to an end. Canada had made it through the war as a profoundly changed country, and a country now that had entered into the world stage. We're going to take a look briefly at some of the immediate effects following the war, and then we're going to move into some of the changes of the 1920s. So the aftermath of World War I really begins with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 in Paris. So the Treaty of Versailles, as I have already said, was really not a great treaty. First of all, it was heavily punitive and blamed Germany entirely for the war. And as we've already learned, World War I was not caused by one country. It was caused by a number of different reasons, all happening at the same time. And to really pin it all on one country is more than a little bit disingenuous. However, Germany was the loser, and the winning countries wanted to blame Germany for it all. Germany forced to suffer a massive loss of territory and other really humiliating conditions, like not being able to have a military, and also, worst of all, I suppose, for the economic conditions that would follow in Germany, they had to make these huge reparation payments to the victor countries, namely France and Britain. And this is partially because France and Britain had gone into such huge debt to pay for the war that they really needed somebody else to pay it for them. But of course, Germany had also gone into debt during the war. Well, you can see where this is headed. It will be ultimately one of the contributors for the Great Depression, but that is yet to come. So suffice to say, this was not a great document. It was an unfair document in many ways. And a lot of the problems that happened in the 1920s, 1930s leading up to World War II, you could blame partially on the Treaty of Versailles. In any respect, it did mark the formal end of World War I. So, what's next? What happened after the war? Well, I suppose the first initial consequence of World War I is there was a brief recession. Nearly every country had a bit of a recession once they stopped paying, spending all kinds of money on the war effort. There was a clawback in the economy. But in some places, that recession would extend well into the 1920s, and in other places, it resolved itself rather quickly. And this is where we start to get two very different stories of the economy during the 1920s. Well, I know a lot of the time we complain about 2020 being a bad year, but I have to say 1918 was probably a pretty bad year too, because we had just finished the most bloody conflict in human history, and we were about to get into the worst epidemic in human history. That's right, the 1918 flu epidemic, sometimes known as the Spanish flu. Just as a note, the reason why it's sometimes referred to as the Spanish flu is because its first notice that there was something going on happened to be in Spanish newspapers. They were the first newspapers to report on the phenomena, and so it spread from there, being referred to as the Spanish flu. But there's no indications that it even began in Spain, so it's a bit of a misnomer. However, the Spanish flu would be the worst pandemic the world had ever seen. It would kill at least 20 million people, and that is a very low estimate. And even by that very low estimate, that is twice as many people who died in World War I would die as a result of this flu epidemic. It spread all around the world. It was, in fact, exacerbated by the fact that soldiers were returning home from the war front and they were bringing the flu with them. So the flu got sent to basically every corner of the globe. This epidemic was terrible. Unlike COVID, it was most aggressive and susceptible to people who were in their prime. Young people, people in their early 20s or teenagers were particularly at risk of dying from this influenza epidemic. To put it in perspective, Canada alone, there were 50,000 deaths, which is, in this case in Canada, they lost slightly more than World War I, slightly less than World War I, and they lost 60,000 in World War I, but almost as many, which is really quite phenomenal. I'm going to show you some pictures that'll sort of put you back in what it was like to be alive during the year to year and a half or so that the flu epidemic ran its course. And I'm sure that to many of you, these pictures are going to feel very familiar based on what we have been going through in modern times with COVID. So here you see on the right an image of a Toronto theater which was closed and a boy standing out front wearing a mask. There was no real treatment for the influenza epidemic of 1918. There were regular cases being reported in the media then, just as with COVID cases today. Here you see a headline from the front page of the Winnipeg Evening Tribune telling the story of the flu's impact in Winnipeg. On the right, you see a picture of nurses carrying a coffin outside a funeral home in Winnipeg during the Spanish flu epidemic. They ran out of spaces in hospitals to be able to deal with all of the sick people who were dying from the influenza epidemic. So army bases were often converted into makeshift hospitals. Here you see an image of soldiers at Fort Riley, Kansas, ill with the Spanish flu in a hospital ward on the military base itself. Just as we've been through with the COVID epidemic in modern times, the 1918 flu epidemic saw similar strategies to try to control the spread. So businesses were forced to shut down, particularly places where it would be more likely to spread indoors, such as theaters, for example. Also, there was mandated social distancing and hygiene. There was the requirement, and in many cases the law, that you had to wear a face mask in order to stop the spread. In many jurisdictions in the United States, in the Midwest, for example, it was considered one's patriotic duty to help stop the spread of the flu epidemic by wearing a mask. Eventually, by the middle of 1920, the flu epidemic had finally run its course. Less and less people were dying, although the death total around the world was catastrophic. With the flu epidemic finally under control, we begin to move into a new era of the 1920s. So all countries face some difficulty adjusting to the reality of the post-war environment and the post-war economy. For 4 years, countries had oriented their entire economic base to support the war effort. Factories were making munitions or building tanks or building airplanes, and suddenly now the demand for all those things was gone. Unemployment was very high. Soldiers returning from the war found that there were no longer jobs for them. There were very few jobs for veterans. And all of this resulted in a worldwide recession from 1920 to 1924. This also increased much of the angst and division between the workers and the employers. And this would continue to bring workers' rights to the forefront of the political sphere. And this brings us to one of the defining moments in the history of labor relations in Canada, and that is the Winnipeg General Strike. The Winnipeg General Strike began when workers in the building and metal trades in Winnipeg were struggling to get some basic labor rights. They wanted the right to collective bargaining, that is the right to simply have a union bargain for a group of people, better wages, and better working conditions, none of which were the norm in post-war Canada. Then the Winnipeg Trades and Labor Council, which was a loosely knit organization which represented these workers, called for a general strike in the city To everyone's surprise, it took off like wildfire and became the largest strike in Canadian history. Over 30,000 people walked off the job for 6 whole weeks, and this included many workers in public-facing roles such as firefighters and police officers, all of whom walked off the job too. Factories, shops, transit, city services all shut down. Everything essentially ground to a halt in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Then shortly thereafter, we started seeing sister strikes pop up in other Canadian cities, all demanding the same basic worker rights. After about 6 weeks of the general strike, the government and industry took a very dim view of the continued shutdown of Winnipeg, Manitoba. This resulted in a show of force by the government, which really spun out of control. It became known as Bloody Saturday. On June 20th, 1919, Royal Northwest Mounted Police on horseback charged at protesters. In the ensuing violence, about 30 people were injured and 2 people were killed. So eventually the strike then petered out, but the consequences of the strike, can still be felt in many respects today because it built the momentum towards the modern labor movement. It sparked more unionism and activism across the country. We saw sister strikes happening all over the place, and eventually Canadian worker unions did achieve recognition and collective bargaining rights, and largely because of events like the Winnipeg General Strike. So the status of women had fundamentally changed after the war. And I don't mean just in a legal sense, because women would eventually achieve women's suffrage, the right to, well, at least white women anyway, would achieve the right to vote in 1920. But culturally, the status of women had begun to change. As women had moved out into the workforce temporarily, filling in those factory jobs, they were existing in a much more public space than they had been before in Victorian times. In Victorian times, women had really been relegated to the domestic sphere only, but that had changed. And it's seen all over the place. In the 1920s, we see changing and relaxing style norms for women in women's clothing. We see women participating in things that would have been unheard of a generation before. So, for instance, just take a look at this 1915 picture where women are learning to shoot guns at a camp near Toronto. Suffrage had been achieved, for some women anyway, in 1920 with the Dominion Elections Act, which finally allowed certain women to vote in federal elections. However, it excluded many on the basis of race. So Japanese women, women of Japanese descent, women of Chinese descent, women of South Asian descent, black women, none of them were included in this Dominion Elections Act. So they still were unfortunately not allowed to vote. And also Inuit and most First Nations women were also still excluded from voting. So we need to temper our expectations about how far people had come in 1920, but nevertheless, it still was a step forward for women's rights that some women at least now were participatory in the political process. So barriers continued to be broken by women in the 1920s. In 1921, Agnes MacPhail became the first woman elected to the House of Commons. So that means that she held one of the seats in the House of Commons. She was elected by people to represent their riding in Canada, which is a remarkable accomplishment. The House of Commons, of course, is just one part of Parliament, though. It's the elected body. But if you recall from the lecture where I explained how Canadian government works, the other part of Parliament is the Senate, and the Senate is an appointed body. A certain number of senators are appointed from each province to sit on the Senate. The government of the time believed that women were ineligible to sit on the Senate. Now, why did they think that? It's because they interpreted the BNA Act, that is the British North American Act, which specified that members of the Senate must be qualified people, a qualified person of at least 30 years of age, owning property in excess of $4,000, and living in the province of appointment. And the government believed that women were not technically people under the laws. That was the one criteria that they didn't meet. They could be 30, they could own property, and they could live in a province, but they were not people, which is a very strange interpretation, as you can imagine. Well, in 1929, 5 women who became known as the Famous Five, led informally by Emily Murphy, who is the second from the right there, who is actually the very first female magistrate in the entire British Empire. That magistrate is a judge, basically. And so she already had to deal with the persons issue. In one of her first cases, one of the lawyers in the case said that she was not qualified to be presiding over the case because she was not a person under the law. So this was something obviously she felt passionate about. And together these 5 women then petitioned the Supreme Court to actually answer this question: could women sit on the Senate? Well, the Supreme Court of Canada said no, that women were not people under the law. Now, at this point in time, the Supreme Court of Canada was not actually the highest court of the land. At that point in time, because Canada wasn't completely independent in all regards, at that point in time, there actually was a further court of appeal, and that would be to appeal all the way to the British Privy Council in London. And so the Judicial Committee of the British Privy Council actually overturned the Supreme Court of Canada and ruled that women were people under the law. And thus, as a result of the activism of the Famous Five, women could now be appointed to the Senate. So by the mid-1920s, the economy has really begun to rebound in many Western countries, including Canada. It rebounds to such a degree that the 1920s are sometimes referred to as the Roaring Twenties. There was a massive growth in consumer products and jobs, and all of this really is a culmination of something that historians sometimes refer to as the Second Industrial Revolution. If the First Industrial Revolution was the beginning of a mechanized age, the Second Industrial Revolution took this a step further with the introduction of assembly lines, mass production, and most importantly, electricity. A good example of assembly line production is the Ford Motor Company, which became one of the most successful mass-produced products in the world. Their Model T Ford and their Ford sedans became a car that was pretty much affordable to most middle-class families. As you see an advertisement here for a Ford sedan for $890, and these cars were made all over the place, including Canada. So this is actually an image inside a Ford Motor Company showroom that was in Toronto at roughly Christie Street and DuPont Street. And the building is still there. It had cars manufactured on the upper levels, and there was even a track on the roof where they would test the cars, and then the showroom was on the first floor. Today, the showroom became a cafe where you can get some really nice pizza called Faima. Sadly, the cafe seems to have shut down due to the COVID-19 pandemic and hasn't reopened. So we're all hopeful in the neighborhood, this is nearby where I live, that it will open again because they did make really good pizza. It's during this time period that historians and social scientists would identify the beginnings of something that we call mass society. So what is mass society? A society in which traditional social ties and divisions have weakened in favor of broad homogeneity, that is, similarity. But what do we mean by that? Mass society comes with it this massive growth in consumption and advertising. It also comes along with this increase in media production. And so we have like Hollywood churning out movies, we have radios, and all of this is creating this sort of shared global culture. Mass consumption and mass society means that people around the world are buying the same things, they're consuming the same cultural cues around the world. It's not to say that there aren't local differences, but it does mean that we're beginning now to share in a collective society, a mass society now. And it's something, of course, that we still live in today when you think about, say, pop music or movies. I mean, these are things that we share nearly around the entire planet. And this really only begins for the first time in the 1920s. It's also during this time that we see the democratization of leisure. Previous to the 20th century, things like going on vacation or taking a holiday were something only that the ultra wealthy could do. But once we reach the 1920s, the economy is such that we start to see middle class people doing things like taking a holiday. Part of this is a result of the betterment of the economy, but part of it is also just a cultural shift as well too. We see people using their cars to pile them up with their suitcases and drive out to the beach and take a family holiday. It's also the result of changing labor laws that allow things like holidays. And all of this is happening in the so-called Roaring 1920s. In the Roaring 1920s, we start to see a lot of cultural changes. For instance, we see a relaxation of expressions of sexuality and dress. We see the spread of African American culture, particularly jazz music, coming out of America. There you see a poster for Josephine Baker, who is one of the most famous jazz singers of the 1920s, an African American woman. We also see, for women in general, flapper fashion and style, which you see actress Louise Brooks there dressed in the typical fashion of the day, flapper fashion. And this is really a reaction against the really strict Victorian ideal of women, which had them covered completely with clothing. Even their ankles really couldn't be shown. So the Roaring 20s really represent a massive relaxation in the way we dress and in the expression of sexuality. However, it's also important to note that it wasn't the same for everyone. There was a cultural backlash of sorts against all of these changes in society. At no point in time is everybody changing the exact same way. Just as for some people, social norms were opening up a little bit or loosening up, for other people, they feared those changes. Many traditionalists feared that society was in the grip of a moral breakdown. And at the same time that for some women, they were expressing themselves differently with clothing and expressing sexuality a little bit more openly, there was at the same time a concurrent idea that women were supposed to be respectable and that women were supposed to still live in a traditional role in the domestic sphere. So these two ideas both conflict and coexist with one another. In the late teens, just before we get to the 1920s, we also went through a brief period of alcohol prohibition, which we talked about in the previous lecture. And although prohibition had been scaled back, there were still across Canada very strict rules about alcohol consumption. So all of this is happening in the 1920s. On one side, everything is opening up. On another side, people are pulling back. In the 1920s, we also see a changing political landscape as the old guard moves off and the new political leaders take over. So upon the death of Wilfrid Laurier, William Lyon Mackenzie King became the leader of the Liberal Party. And William Lyon Mackenzie King will, of course, go on to become a long-standing prime minister in Canada. He would lead Canada through the Second World War, but that's all in the future. However, when he came into power, he was thought of as a pragmatist and a very business-friendly leader for the Liberal Party. Incidentally, William Lyon Mackenzie King is the grandson of William Lyon Mackenzie. And you might remember that figure from the first half of this course when we talked about the Upper Canada Rebellion. William Lyon Mackenzie was the leader of the Upper Canada Rebellion. He led those, the rabble of drunken men down Yonge Street, in the failed attempt to overturn the family compact. Anyway. This is his grandson, so how things change. On the other side of the political spectrum, when Robert Borden retired in 1920, Arthur Meehan then became the leader of the Conservative Party, and as such, because they were still in power at that point, that meant that he also became the Prime Minister, briefly, of the Union Party. This is that coalition of sorts between some liberals and some conservatives that had formed during the war. But that began to break apart now that the war was over. Also, we will start to see some new political parties enter the scene as well. For example, we see a new political party known as the Progressive Party, which were sometimes referred to at the time as liberals in a hurry. So they were most closely aligned with the Liberal Party. They were very firmly proponents of free trade, but they believed that the Liberals had moved too slowly on many issues, including that. Thomas Crerar was the leader of this party. And then we also see several other smaller parties, farmer parties, such as an Alberta Farmer Party, an Ontario Farmer Party. We also see some Labour parties. So the political scene becomes far more complex than it had been before. And this brings us to the 1921 election. This would be the first major election after World War I. So the scene was set for potentially a major change of the guard. Now, in 1921, there were only 235 seats in the House of Commons. Now, if you recall from the lecture a couple of lectures ago where I explained how government works, the House of Commons seats are awarded based on the population of Canada. So as the population of Canada has increased, they've added more seats to the House of Commons. Today, for example, there are 338 seats in the House of Commons, but there are way more people living in Canada now than there were in 1921. In 1921, there was only 235 seats. So if one political party was going to win a majority government, how many seats would they need? So going into the 1921 election, all the major political parties were looking for 118 seats. That's what a party would need in order to have a majority. Now, if you remember, a majority government is where the controlling party pretty much can pass any laws or legislation that they want, and they don't need to rely on the support of the other parties. So here's where we were in the previous election in 1917. In that election, the Conservatives, or rather the Union Party, that was the temporary party that Robert Borden created that included some disaffected Liberals, won a majority government. They won 153 seats, and the Liberals only won 82 seats under Wilfrid Laurier. So Robert Borden became prime minister when they won that majority government, as he was the leader of the Conservative Party. So Wilfrid Laurier dies in 1919, and William Lyon Mackenzie King becomes the new leader of the Liberal Party. And then Robert Borden decides to retire in 1920, or rather, we should call him Sir Robert Borden, because he accepted a knighthood in 1915. And when he retired, because it wasn't time yet to have a new election, with majority governments, we only have an election every 4 years, that meant that the Conservative Party just chose another one of their members to become the new leader of the Conservative Party, and thus, by virtue of the fact that the Conservatives held the most number of seats, that person also became prime minister, and that person was Arthur Meighen. So Arthur Meighen became the new prime minister in 1920, and there wasn't another election or anything. It just simply, the torch was passed to Arthur Meighen. So this was the situation going into the 1921 election. So what happened with that election? So the Liberals won a narrow majority in the 1921 election with William Lyon Mackenzie King as the Liberal leader. They won 118 seats, the exact number you needed for a majority government. And the Conservatives suffered a pretty massive defeat, going from 153 seats to just 49 seats. We also see the rise of a brand new party, the Progressive Party under Thomas Crerar, at 58 seats. And then we see these other smaller parties, such as the Labour Party, the United Farmers of Ontario, the United Farmers of Alberta, and then there were 4 independent seats. So after the election, we could say we are now in a majority government situation. And Arthur Meighen, who was the prime minister, now has to pass that prime ministership to William Lyon Mackenzie King, because his party has the most number of seats, and thus we are in a majority government situation. So that means that William Lyon Mackenzie King could govern uninterrupted for the next 4 years. 4 years later, though, with the 1925 election, the population of Canada had increased, and so new seats were added to the House of Commons. So we went from 235 seats to 245 seats. So now the number needed to actually attain a majority government for the 1925 election would be a different number. So now one would need 123 seats for a majority government. So this is how the 1925 election turned out. The Liberals won 100 seats, the Conservatives 115, and the Progressive Party 22. Now notice that no party has 118 seats. So we know now that no party has a majority. So we are in a minority government situation. Now, who do you think would become Prime Minister under the circumstances? Now, William Lyon Mackenzie King was Prime Minister going into the election. But the Conservatives now have 115 seats, 15 more seats than the Liberals. So you might assume that automatically Arthur Meehan would become Prime Minister. However, convention, according to Westminster politics, makes it clear that the Prime Minister is whoever can command the confidence of the House. And in a minority government situation, that could potentially be any leader of a political party. That means whatever political party leader can get the votes to pass their laws in Parliament. And because Mackenzie King was Prime Minister before the election, by convention, he got first crack at testing the confidence of the House. So that meant he remained Prime Minister after the 1925 election, and he was able to govern. He managed to get the votes, and he continued to govern up to a year when the Liberals lost a confidence motion in 1926. Now this ultimately set up a constitutional crisis about what would happen next. Mackenzie King thought that we would simply have another election. He went to the Governor-General, as one does, and asked the Governor-General to dissolve Parliament and call another election because the Liberals had lost a confidence motion. But that's not exactly how it played out. So the Governor-General at that time was Julian Byng. And because the election, the most recent one, had been just 1 year earlier, when Mackenzie King came to him and said that he had lost a confidence motion, he no longer had the confidence of the House, and he would like to have another election, the Governor-General, this is one of those rare instances where the Governor-General, the representative of the Queen, actually has real power. The Governor-General can decide what to do next. Now, normally, Governor-Generals are supposed to follow the advice of the sitting Prime Minister. So the advice of William Lyon Mackenzie King was that there should be another election. However, because the election had been so recent, Julian Byng said, no, I don't think so. Arthur Meehan has 115 seats. He's got more seats than you. I think that he potentially could have the confidence of the House, and we could avoid another election, and he would be Prime Minister. And that's exactly what happened. Mackenzie King was outraged, but that was the way that it works. So Arthur Meehan's new government and second chance as Prime Minister didn't last very long. He and his government were soon defeated also in a vote of no confidence. And this time, the Governor-General agreed to a new election. During the election campaign, Mackenzie King campaigned more against Byng, really, than Meehan and the Conservatives. He used the actions of the Governor-General as a way to whip up support for his party. And the Liberals won a big majority government in the 1926 election. The real consequence of this was that this brief moment when the Governor-General had exerted real power in Canada turned out to be a fleeting moment. No Governor-General again in Canadian history ever refused the advice of a Prime Minister. It's not to say that they couldn't, and they do technically have the power, but not since Julian Byng confronted Mackenzie King has another Governor-General actually exerted that power. Well, the good times of the Roaring Twenties had to end sometime, and the Great Depression of the 1930s would change everything. The economic downturn that lasted for the decade of the 1930s, the Great Depression, is really unprecedented in recent Western history. Never since has there ever been an economic downturn quite as significant as the Great Depression. It would affect every aspect of life around the world. Although it originated in the United States, no country on the planet would be untouched by its effects. No less important were the cultural and social spin-offs that also happened as a result of the 1930s Great Depression. So how did it happen and what was it? Let's take a look now. So let's start by talking about what it was. The Great Depression was a severe economic crisis which lasted more than a decade. As I said, it originated in the USA, but it spread worldwide. This is an indication of just how intertwined the world economy had become by the time we get to the 1930s. A severe shock in one part of the system could have an effect in every other part. Normally, the stock market crash of 1929 is the way that people would say the beginning of the Great Depression. But really, the stock market crash was a symptom of the Great Depression. It had already begun. The reasons for the Great Depression are complex and varied and still debated by economists and historians today. But I'll try to explain to you some of the main theories about why it took place. Needless to say, the Great Depression caused massive suffering worldwide. It was even felt here in Canada. Here you see an image of unemployed men in Toronto during the Great Depression, and one of the images I just showed you earlier was unemployed men in Winnipeg. In 1933, at the height of the Great Depression, there was a 20% unemployment rate in Canada. To put this into perspective, even in the last several recessions, we've never come close to that type of employment rate. At the height of the COVID pandemic, at the beginning of May 2020, we reached an unprecedented level of 13% unemployment, but that had fallen to just 9% by September of 2020. It's hard to imagine what 20% unemployment would feel like. The result was the Great Depression. So why did the Great Depression happen? Well, there is no single one answer, and I will say that the debate amongst economists and historians continues to this day about all the different complexities that led to the Great Depression. However, we can point to 4 factors which almost certainly worked together to cause the Depression. The first factor was war debt. This is debt coming out of the First World War, and many Western countries were heavily indebted, particularly European countries, but also the United States as well. Also, in the late 1920s, there was quite a bit of stock market speculation. Credit was relatively easy to come by. That means it was relatively easy to borrow money, and interest rates were relatively low. This encouraged more risky borrowing than otherwise might have happened. We'll also talk about a concept called overproduction and underconsumption. This was a phenomena of the late Second Industrial Revolution where products were outpacing customers to actually buy them. And finally, falling grain prices in the late 1920s also contributed to the Great Depression. So I'm going to discuss each of these factors in a little bit more detail. So I want to talk a little bit about how the cycle of war debt contributed to the Great Depression. So during the First World War, countries were racking up tons and tons of debt to pay for their war effort. Remember, countries were participating in total war. That is, that they were mobilizing their entire economy, their entire citizenry, their entire industrial base in order to support the war effort. And that is really expensive. Britain and France in particular had relied on borrowing money from the United States in order to support their war effort. Germany had also found itself hugely in debt. Unfortunately for Germany, it lost the war. And if you recall, the Treaty of Versailles was not particularly kind to the Germans. Britain and France insisted on huge reparation payments that the Germans would be forced to make to Britain and France to bear their cost for the responsibility for the war. Now, the thing is that Germany really didn't have the money to pay those reparation payments, and so this was going to be a problem. The stability of Germany in the 1920s was something that was of concern. Nobody wanted to see the country descend into another war again. Yet during the 1920s, we saw Germany going through periods of hyperinflation. Their economy was basically in shambles. Part of this was to do with paying those huge reparation payments to Britain and France, And Britain and France, of course, needed those reparation payments in order to make their debt payments to the United States. In comes the United States to try to figure out a solution to this problem. A so-called Dawes Plan, named after the Vice President of the United States, saw the United States loan money to Germany so that Germany could stabilize its economy and pay its reparation payments to Britain and France, so that Britain and France could in turn pay back their debt to the United States. You can see that this is really a very strange cycle of debt, money moving around in a circle. Needless to say, it wouldn't take much for this whole house of cards to come crashing down. Another contributing factor to the Great Depression was speculation. So what is speculation? Well, speculation is simply investing, but it's different from regular investing in a few important factors. Normally, when an investor invests in a company, it's because that investor believes that the company is sound, that the company will increase in value over time, and that they're making a smart investment because the products of the company that they sell are going to be continuing to be in demand, etc., etc. A speculator isn't as concerned about the actual bricks and mortar aspect of a business. They are concerned about one thing and one thing only. Is the stock going to go up? And if the stock is going to go up, then who cares whether the company is sound? Who cares whether the company is solvent? We can still make money off of it. So speculators are looking to make quick money out of the stock market by buying stocks at one price and then selling it hopefully a little bit later on at a higher price and making a profit. Now this works, of course, as long as the stock market is going up. And there have always been speculators, and there always will be speculators. And normally speculation is not going to cause a contraction in the system. What happened during the 1920s is that the speculation was based partially on debt. And this is where it started to cause problems. So often speculators, when they wanted to invest in the stock market, didn't necessarily have all the money themselves to be able to buy the stock. However, stock brokers and stock market firms, often in a goal to sell as much stock as possible, would often allow them to simply pay 10% of the price of the stock, and then they would lend them the 90% that was remaining. Now again, there's no problem with this as long as the stock price goes up, because at the end of the day, the stock will be more valuable, the investor will be able to make money, and the firms that sold the stock will be able to have their debt repaid. So it's all good as long as the stock market is going up. Frequently, speculators didn't even have to pay the 10% themselves. Instead, they would turn to banks, and banks would lend them the 10%. So you would have people who are investing in the stock market with actually none of their own money. It would all be borrowed money. Now, you can imagine that this can be dangerous, because if the stock market goes down for whatever reason, we're going to have problems. The banks themselves were also involved in speculation and were constantly reinvesting whatever capital they had into the stock market. Well, in the late 1920s, it does come crashing down. And when it does, this whole house of cards, which is supported by debt, which has very little real capital at its base, is going to cause a massive contraction, which it does when the stock market crashed in September of 1929. The third factor contributing to the Great Depression is overproduction and underconsumption. By the time we get to the late 1920s, we're at the height of the Second Industrial Revolution. Production techniques, assembly line techniques, had become so sophisticated that products had become cheaper and cheaper to produce. However, wages at the same time had not kept pace. By the end of the 1920s, there were basically too many consumer goods being unsold in the United States. Essentially, everyone who could afford to buy a radio or afford to buy a car had already purchased one. Mass production methods had essentially led to supply outstripping demand. What companies then did next often exacerbated the problem and made it worse. As people weren't buying their products, companies laid off workers. With workers laid off, there were even less people available to buy consumer products. So all of this reached a head right before the Great Depression in the late 1920s. So the fourth contributing factor to the Great Depression were falling grain prices during the 1920s. During the First World War, U.S. farmers had been encouraged to try to grow more food to support the war effort, and prices during the war years for grain were steadily rising. This in turn encouraged more and more people to get into the farming business. More land was purchased and put under the plow, farming equipment was purchased, often taking on debt to do so. However, after the war, the demand for grain sharply fell. This meant that farmers who had already invested in all of this equipment had to make some stark choices. They could either declare bankruptcy or they could try to sell more grain to make up the difference. Most people had no choice but to try to sell more grain. More grain coming onto the market further depressed the prices, and farmers were forced yet again to make that same choice, and so more and more land in turn was put under the plow. This caused a runaway ecological effect in the center part of North America, the Midwestern part of the United States and Canada. So that whole area of North America, it's sometimes referred to as the basket of North America. It's where tons of food was grown at that time and is still grown today. However, it is naturally a very arid part of the continent as well, and it goes through regular cycles of drought. Normally, the land is held in place, though, by large grasslands, and the grasslands keep the topsoil from blowing away. However, since so much of the land had been turned into agriculture, when drought came and the winds came, there was nothing to stop it from becoming a runaway effect, and this is what led to the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, a man-made ecological disaster. Here you see a farmer and his two sons during a dust storm in Oklahoma in 1936. The Dust Bowl essentially turned large parts of the Midwestern United States and Canada into a desert. Approximately 2 million people became homeless as farms and towns were abandoned throughout the Midwest. For the better part of a decade, images such as this would have been commonplace in the Midwestern United States and Canada. Here you see a massive dust storm rolling into town. These dust storms could be so bad that it was difficult to breathe. Children sometimes would be kept at school overnight because it wasn't safe for them to walk home. Here you see some children wearing goggles and homemade dust masks in the Midwest United States during the Dust Bowl. The dust was thick. It could cover homes. It could cover machinery. In many cases, whole towns and farms were completely abandoned. Hundreds of thousands of people from Oklahoma alone were forced to essentially flee the state. The term Okie came to be used almost as a derogatory term to refer to these migrants from Oklahoma and other states as they came to places like California looking for work. Thus, the Great Depression also marked a massive migration of people from state to state as they desperately tried to provide for their families. Generally speaking, the way world governments reacted to the Great Depression made it worse. They never encountered anything like this before. They acted according to a classical economic theory, and those theories basically intensified the crisis. Under classical economic theory, if tax revenue is falling, which of course it did during the Great Depression, then governments should in turn spend less. But as government activity decreases, so does the ability for people to get work and to pay taxes, and so it creates sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is what you would normally do on a personal level. Like if you lost your job, you would cut back. But in the Great Depression, governments cutting back spending turned out to be the worst possible thing that they could do. We also see a spike in interest rates everywhere. So nobody wants to lend anyone else any money because no one believes that they can pay it back. And so if they are going to lend money, then they're going to do it at a huge interest rate. So this essentially, again, diminishes economic activity and makes it worse. To top it all off, everybody, all the countries that is, started to be very protective over trade. They started to enact tariffs so that their local domestic industries would be protected. But that also meant that other people were enacting tariffs. So if Canada enacts a tariff, the United States enacts a tariff, and they end up not being able to sell to each other. Again, this diminishes economic activity. Now, there were some people that were calling for a new approach. One person is the British economist John Maynard Keynes. As it became known, the Keynesian alternative would be eventually the path that most governments would start to take. And generally speaking, this is now the way most governments react to recessions. And that is that governments should spend money. Governments should do the opposite of what they did during the Great Depression, that they should, in fact, in the absence of a functioning economy, if everyone else is afraid to spend, then the government has to. So the Keynesian approach can be seen in what the United States did beginning in 1933, which was called the New Deal. And this was a series of domestic programs, basically building roads and government buildings and infrastructure, where they just simply hired as many people as they possibly could, just put as many American men to work. Between 1933 and 1938. The idea is that the government will hire people if nobody else will, and then these people will take their earnings, and some of that money is going to go back into the economy because they're going to be buying things with it. The seeming success of the New Deal in the United States created pressure in Canada as well that Canadian politicians should try to do similar types of intervention. Here you see unemployed men from Toronto protesting, hoping that their government would actually do something about the Great Depression. And soon enough, in the election of 1930, government intervention in the economy became one of the major election issues. The 1930 election really was an election on the Great Depression. Mackenzie King had the unfortunate timing to have been the Prime Minister when the Great Depression hit, and as such, he lost the election in 1930 to the Conservatives because the Canadian public was hungry for someone else to try anything at all, to see if they could improve the conditions in Canada. The new leader of the Conservative Party, and thus the new Prime Minister, was Richard Bedford Bennett, or better known as R.B. Bennett. In 1934, Bennett proposed his own version of the New Deal, similar to what was being enacted in the United States. Bennett's New Deal included social and labor reform, a minimum wage, and a maximum work week. He also proposed trade reform and monetary reform, the creation of a central bank in 1934, and an increase in the money supply. All of this represented a massive change in the way governments dealt with the economy. This was a massive government intervention in the economy. And it was a number of measures that were being enacted by governments around the world desperate to turn the tide of the Great Depression. The 1930s also saw the emergence of new political parties on both the left and the right side of the political spectrum, and the rise of populism in politics in general. Populism is a type of political approach that embraces sort of mass appeal of ideas and often posits sort of an us versus them, with the elites being the bad guys and the people being the good guys. On the left, we see the emergence of a new political party called the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, or the CCF, in 1932. They were a party that embraced many socialist ideals. They were quite successful at the provincial level. Some provinces had CCF oppositions by 1939, and the party basically continued to exist and eventually sort of changed into the modern NDP party. On the right side of the political spectrum, we see a new political party called the Social Credit Party of Canada. It was founded in Alberta by an evangelist. The social credit policy involved issuing money, regulating prices. They were elected in Alberta in 1935 and remained in power until 1971. The party over time became very paranoid and anti-Semitic, and social credit eventually abandoned the radicalism, but it largely disappeared in the 1970s. So while the CCF does still in one form exist as the modern NDP party today, the Social Credit Party doesn't really have any modern equivalent anymore. So by 1935, well, the Depression was still going on, and that meant that all of R.B. Bennett's, changes that he had made, none of them had really had the desired effect of changing anything in the Great Depression. And really, that was pretty much the same news everywhere else in the world as well. And so the public was obviously very dissatisfied with this political leadership. And in 1935, Mackenzie King found himself swept back into power and becoming prime minister once again. King, rather than just simply, trying new ideas, he appointed an investigative commissions to study the Depression, so that would get him off the hook for at least a little bit of time. But what really would save Mackenzie King ultimately would be what would save politicians everywhere. The end of the Great Depression would come in just a few years with the beginning of World War II. During the 1920s and the 1930s, we also see Canada begin to take a more active role in diplomacy on the world stage. Canada was a founding member of the League of Nations, which had been founded after World War I in an effort to prevent a future conflict like that happening again. The League of Nations is a precursor to the modern UN today. The British government had also laid out a path for more independence from Britain in the future for both Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and other Dominion countries. The Statute of Westminster effectively made it possible for a Commonwealth country to become more independent at their own decision at their own timetable. So this would be something that Canada would take advantage of in the future as it became more and more independent. At the same time, in the 1920s and 1930s, the world order was being challenged by the rise of fascism. Leaders such as Mussolini and Hitler would threaten world peace and bring the world to the brink of war once again. For the most part, Ottawa reacted somewhat passively to these aggressive nations such as Italy, Spain, Germany, and Japan. One example is the 1935 Italian invasion of Ethiopia, where the League of Nations forcefully condemned Mussolini for his attack on Ethiopia, which he had done for no other reason than Italy could attack Ethiopia. In fact, the Canadian representative on the League of Nations had suggested that Canada adopt more forceful sanctions against Italy as a result, but Mackenzie King didn't want to upset the apple cart and vetoed that decision. For the most part, as the world teetered closer and closer to war by the end of the 1930s, Canada found itself not at all militarily prepared for what was to come. So here you see Ottawa in 1938, just a year out from the start of World War II. So what can we say then about the interwar years for Canada? Well, we can certainly say that it was a society in transition. Canada, like many Western countries, was in the throes of a transition into what we would think of as a modern consumer culture. Yet the Great Depression had threatened many of those changes and was a profound challenge to Canada and other countries. As Canada became more present on the world stage, Canada also was passive for the most part on that same stage. Canada was not ready for what was to come in World War II. Next week, we are going to explore Canada in the Second World War. We're going to see the whole world go at it once more as Germany, Japan, and Italy throw us once again into conflict. Until then, here on Canadian History.